Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating question that sits right at the intersection of economics and religion. We're going to look at a detailed analysis of Islamic economic principles and then see how they stack up against real-world outcomes.
So, let's kick things off with a pretty big idea. What if you could design an entire economic system not just to make a profit, but to be built on a foundation of justice, fairness, and the well-being of the whole community? What would that even look like?
Well, to really get our heads around that, we first need to explore the blueprint for an ideal economy, as it's laid out in Islamic teachings.
Right, so the central purpose here isn't just about, economic growth for the sake of it. According to the source, it's all about fostering a healthy society, an ummah, where people can genuinely flourish. And it's a system where the government is expected to step in when collective action is needed for the common good.
And this blueprint, it gets really specific with some pretty ambitious goals. On one side, you have these big societal aims like getting rid of poverty and making sure everyone has an equal shot at education and healthcare. But then you also have the nuts and bolts to make it happen, protecting property rights, stamping out corruption, and creating an interest-free financial system to support it all.
Now, this is where it gets super interesting. The source actually draws a parallel between this vision and, wait for it, the foundational ideas of modern capitalism. Specifically, it points to Adam Smith's other famous book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which really argues that morality is this essential check on pure self-interest.
All right, so that's the ideal, right? The blueprint for this just and prosperous society. But how does that vision actually stack up against what's happening on the ground?
And that brings us right to the heart of the matter for this explainer. How do the economies of countries that follow Islam actually measure up against this incredible vision? Okay, let's dive into the data and see what it says. So, to measure all this, the source material grabs some key metrics from big players like the United Nations and the World Bank. They're specifically looking at the economic and social performance of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Countries, or the OIC for short.
First up, let's look at overall human development. We're talking about the Human Development Index, or HDI. You can think of it as a broad report card that combines health, education, and living standards all into one score.
And boom, right out of the gate, the data shows something really stark. The analysis finds that for a full 30-year period, the OIC countries as a group, well, they've consistently lagged behind the world average in overall development.
Okay, what about education? This is a really big deal in the blueprint we just talked about. The source even notes it's seen as a pillar of the Islamic vision and a major driver of economic growth.
And you guessed it, the data tells a pretty similar story here. When you look at the UN Education Index, the OIC's performance has also been well below the world average over those same 3 decades. It's a consistent pattern.
All right, so what about health and life expectancy? Does the pattern hold up? Let's check out the UN Health Index, which measures a country's health conditions based on life expectancy at birth.
And yep, the research finds that human health conditions in OIC countries as a group are far below world standards. The data is just remarkably consistent across all these different areas.
Okay, finally, let's look at the dollars and cents, or, income and living standards. The last big metric here is the UN Income Index. It's all about the standard of living, based on gross national income per person.
No big surprises here. The pattern continues. IOC living standards are well below the world average. But, and this is a really important but, the analysis points out a huge exception: the 6 super oil-rich Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC. These guys perform right up there with highly developed nations, but they are a total outlier compared to the rest of the IOC group.
So when you put it all together, this data shows a really clear, really persistent gap between that amazing blueprint we started with and the reality on the ground. The big question is, why? What explains this disconnect?
It's a natural question, right? Is the problem with the principles themselves? Is the blueprint somehow flawed from the start?
Well, the source comes back with a really clear answer on this. It states that there's little evidence to attribute the subpar economic performance of Muslim countries to Islamic teachings. So, according to this analysis, the answer is a firm no.
Okay, so if the principles aren't the problem, what do they actually support? Well, the analysis points out that they're actually fully in line with what you need for growth and prosperity. We're talking about things we all associate with strong economies: efficient institutions, free markets, good governance, equal opportunity, the whole shebang.
And all of this leads us to the final big takeaway from this whole analysis. The issue here isn't about the principles. It's about the practice. It's about implementation.
Basically, what the source is arguing is that all the core ingredients of modern economic theory, even the stuff Adam Smith talked about, are right there in this blueprint. But there's one huge addition: a non-negotiable, rock-solid foundation of justice and fairness.
And, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. Here you have this 1,400-year-old framework tackling the very same challenge that modern Western philosophers like John Rawls spent their careers on. How in the world do you build a system that isn't just efficient, but is fundamentally just?
And that's really the big provocative question to leave you with. The source lays out a blueprint for a just economy, but the challenge it raises is universal. If the principles for a just and prosperous society exist, whether they're in ancient texts or modern philosophy, what does it actually take for any nation or any system to finally bridge that gap between the blueprint and reality?